The Colonel Has No One to Write to Him is a novel by the famous Colombian writer Gabriel García Márquez, affectionately known as Garbo. First published in 1961, this work is one of the most outstanding examples of García Márquez's literary style and Latin American magical realism, although it is more sober and less fantastical than some of his other famous works, such as 100 Years of Solitude. The first chapter of No One Writes to the Colonel by Gabriel García Márquez introduces the protagonist, a retired colonel, who has been caught in a long wait of over 15 years for a government pension due to his service in the civil wars. This wait becomes the central axis of the novel and reflects a mix of idealism and obsession on the part of the colonel, who eagerly anticipates the arrival of the letter every Friday, hoping it will change his fortune. The colonel and his wife, who suffers from asthma, live in conditions of extreme poverty and despair. The novel describes how their daily life is marked by a constant struggle for survival, where even the maintenance of their home reflects a state of decay and deterioration. The precariousness of their situation is exacerbated by the memory of their son Augustin, who was killed for subversive activities, leaving them only a fighting cock as an inheritance. The story also reveals how the colonel's environment, a town under an oppressive regime, is equally affected by violence and censorship. In this context, the fighting cock represents both a connection to their deceased son and a possible, albeit uncertain, source of income and hope. Despite their precarious situation and the constant fight against adversity, the colonel maintains a calm and dignified attitude, without complaining about his circumstances. Thus, the first chapter establishes central themes such as waiting, hope in the face of adversity, dignity amidst poverty, and criticism of corruption and violence in a Latin American context. The colonel's story becomes a reflection of the reality of many in a region marked by conflicts and inequalities. Regarding the lessons from the chapter, we can highlight the importance of resilience and human dignity in adverse situations. The colonel's persistent wait, despite the slim chances of success, underscores human tenacity and clinging to hope as a means of surviving unfavorable circumstances. Moreover, the novel criticizes the political and social realities that lead individuals like the colonel to situations of extreme poverty and despair, inviting reflection on justice and social and governmental responsibility. In the second chapter of No One Writes to the Colonel, the story continues to develop the life of the colonel and his wife in their constant struggle against poverty and their wait for the pension. The colonel clings to the hope of improving their economic situation through a fighting cock, an inheritance from their son Augustin, who was killed for subversive activities. For the colonel, this cock represents not only a connection to his son, but also a potential source of income, as it is considered the best fighting cock in the district. The colonel's wife, suffering from asthma, opposes the special attention the colonel gives to the cock, considering their precarious economic situation. Despite this, the colonel clings to the hope the cock represents, reflecting his idealism and resistance to giving up his dreams. The social context in which the story unfolds is equally bleak. The town lives under an oppressive regime, where curfews are common and freedom of speech is restricted. This is reflected in activities like the church's censorship of movies and the clandestine distribution of a newsletter by the town's doctor, with the colonel's support, offering news about local and European events. This chapter delves into the irony and despair surrounding the colonel's life. Despite the admiration he commands for his dignity and calmness, his situation is also pathetic due to his innocence and continuous hope in the face of a government, and a life that seemed to have forgotten him. Lessons that can be drawn from this chapter include the importance of hope and dignity in times of adversity, as well as a critique of corruption and repression in societies where inequality and misery prevail. The colonel, despite his situation, remains steadfast in his principles and hopes, reflecting human resilience in the face of oppression and despair. The story also invites reflection on the importance of memory and legacy, symbolized in the cock that represents both a remembrance of his son and a potential means to improve his life. In the third chapter of No One Writes to the Colonel, the story focuses on the colonel's routine, marked by his constant hope and wait for the pension letter. The colonel lives in a town that seems frozen in time, isolated from the progress and modernity of the outside world. This disconnection is symbolized by how the town receives news, through a boat, in contrast to the airplanes used by the rest of the world. Despite facing extreme poverty and misery, the colonel and his wife try to cope with their daily life with a touch of humor, even using religious references to deal with their lack of food. This humor acts as a defense mechanism against their harsh reality, allowing them to find some lightness in their tragic situation. The chapter also reveals the injustice the colonel faces, having spent years waiting for a pension that seems never to arrive. The wait becomes a symbol of the lack of recognition and support from the government for its veterans. The colonel's situation reflects a critique of corruption and governmental neglect, showing how those who served their country are forgotten and left in misery. Finally, the chapter addresses the issue of the fighting cock inherited from his son, which becomes a source of conflict between the colonel and his wife. Despite the economic difficulties, the colonel refuses to sell the cock, which is both a memory of his son and a symbol of hope. The colonel's decision to keep the cock despite their precarious situation shows his desire to cling to something of value in his life, a representation of his resistance and his inability to give up the little he has left. Therefore, this chapter teaches us about the importance of hope and dignity in difficult times, as well as resistance against injustice and abandonment. The colonel's story is a reflection of human struggle and perseverance in the face of extreme adversity. In Chapter 4 of No One Writes to the colonel faces an even more desperate situation. His wife suffers a relapse, and their lack of resources is so severe that they even pretend to eat to hide their poverty from their neighbors. The fighting cock, inherited from his son, continues to be a central symbol, representing both the memory of his son and a potential source of income. German, a comrade of the colonel's son, offers to help financially with the cock, recognizing its importance to the community. Despite the extreme poverty, the colonel maintains a certain respect in society, valued for his heroic past in the Civil War. However, the chapter highlights the growing desperation of the colonel and his wife, facing the harsh reality of their situation and considering the sale of the cock as a possible way out of their misery. The story continues to explore themes such as dignity amidst poverty, hope against despair, and the struggle for survival in a context of abandonment and corruption. In Chapter 5 of No One Writes to the Colonel, the situation of the colonel and his wife becomes even more critical. The possibility of selling the cock, which symbolizes both the memory of their son and a hope for economic improvement, turns into a crucial decision. The colonel is torn between the need to alleviate their precarious economic situation and the desire to preserve the last link with his son. This chapter delves into the colonel's internal struggle, reflecting themes such as dignity, survival under adverse conditions, and the pain of having to give up something of great emotional value in search of a solution to their misery. The story shows how even in the deepest despair, hope and memories can be both powerful and painful forces. In Chapter 6 of The Colonel Has No One to Write to Him, the colonel faces a difficult decision regarding the sale of the rooster. He visits Don Sabas, but he is undergoing medical treatment. The conversation reveals that Don Sabas plans to resell the rooster at a much higher price than what he offers the colonel. Despite this discovery and the advice of his wife, the colonel still refuses to sell the rooster. The chapter also shows the oppressive political atmosphere of the town, evidenced in a police visit to a pool hall. In this context, the colonel shows his dignity and resilience, maintaining hope for change, despite the apparent futility of his situation. In the final chapter of The Colonel Has No One to Write to Him, the colonel and his wife face a critical moment regarding the rooster and their financial situation. The colonel, stimulated by a premonition, waits for the long-awaited letter, but instead, he discovers that the circus has arrived in town, which represents a change in the monotony of life there. However, hope centers on the rooster when he wins a confrontation in the cockpit. This triumph is celebrated by the people and friends of Augustine, reaffirming the importance of the rooster as a symbol of hope and resistance. Despite pressure and desperation from his wife, the colonel decides not to sell the rooster, clinging to the hope that his situation will improve. This final act of defiance by the colonel, although distressing to his wife, symbolizes his resistance to giving up hope and dignity, despite the harsh reality they face.